In a crawl space not big enough for a human, and where bugs and rodents roam, a man sits, one who is too conscious, hyperconscious, the underground man. In 1864, Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote one of the first, if not one of the most fundamental existentialist works, Notes from Underground. For us to understand the significance of this book, we first have to see in what context it was written in, and what pertinent themes of 18th century Russia he wants to address. The novel was written against the backdrop of 1860s Russia, responding to the rise of nihilism, rational egoism, and other ideologies that Dostoevsky saw as threats to society's moral fabric. There are multiple works of literature that showcase what people saw as the upcoming norm and what their attitudes were going to be towards these new societal developments. Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons was written in 1862. The novel undoubtedly played a significant role in popularizing and reflecting nihilistic sentiments among the Russian intelligentsia of the time. Fathers and Sons was publicized in 1862 during a period of profound transformation in Russia. The 1860s marked the aftermath of the abolition of serfdom in 1861, which brought about significant social and economic changes. The period also witnessed the rise of revolutionary movements and the spread of Western ideas, including nihilism, among the educated youth. Nihilism emerged as a response to the perceived failures of traditional Russian society and the disillusionment of exciting social, political, and religious institutions. Nihilist rejects traditional values, authority, and moral norms, advocating instead for radical skepticism, individual freedom, and the pursuit of personal fulfillment. Turgenev's novel, Fathers and Sons, explores the clash between generations and ideologies in Russian society. The character, Bazarov, became an emblematic figure of the nihilistic movement in Russia, inspiring both admiration and criticism from readers. Fathers and Sons was just one of the many influential books that shaped Russian society. The ideologies Dostoevsky critiqued in Notes from Underground were rational egoism, determinism, utilitarianism, utopianism, atheism, and what would later become communism. All these were movements that intrigued the emerging Russian society. Besides Fathers and Sons, several other books played a role in promoting these ideas, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse of the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men, 1755, influenced Romanticism and existentialism, critiquing society, traditional values, and championing individual freedom, resonating notably with Russian intellectuals. Gogol's Dead Souls, 1842. While not explicitly nihilistic, Gogol's portrayal of Russian society and its moral decay contributed to the cultural climate that gave rise to nihilism in the mid-19th century. His satirical depiction of bureaucracy, corruption, and spiritual emptiness foreshadowed the themes explored in later works like Fathers and Sons, and then ultimately Notes from Underground. Friedrich Nietzsche's work in 1880. Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality, his concepts of the Übermensch, and his proclamation of the death of God had a profound impact on Russian thinkers. His emphasis on individual will to power and the rejection of religious and moral constraints resonated with nihilistic and existentialist currents in Russian literature and philosophy. Although these works were mostly written in the 1880s, after the Notes from Underground, they still showcase what the general attitude towards societal norms such as religion and traditions were. This all culminated into Dostoevsky's ultimate fear of the underground man. The book is divided into two parts. In part 1, the underground man delivers a philosophical monologue in which he introduces himself as a retired civil servant living in St. Petersburg. He reflects on his own consciousness, alienation from society, and disdain from rationality and reason. He argues that human beings are not solely motivated by self-interest, and that irrationality and contradictions are fundamental aspects of human nature. The underground man also recounts various incidents from his past, including his interactions with former schoolmates and his failed attempts at forming meaningful relationships. We now have a better understanding of what the underlying ethos of the book is. I want to go into detail about what I think makes this book so existentially great. The whole premise of The Underground Man is that he is too conscious, so conscious to the extent that he questions and critiques reality into oblivion. It reminds me of a piece Kierkegaard wrote in relation to consciousness and the anxiety it creates. He wrote, "If a man were a beast or an angel, he would not be able to be in dread. That is, if he were utterly unself-conscious or totally unanimal. Since he is a synthesis, he can be in dread." Man grapples with an inherent dread, born of his profound ambiguity and his inability to fully embody either mere animality or angelic purity. He exists in a delicate balance, unable to ignore his fate, yet powerless to assert complete mastery over it. Thus he is forever ensnared within the complexities of the human condition. The spirit cannot do away with itself. Example, self-consciousness cannot disappear. Neither can man sink down into a vegetative life. Example, be wholly an animal. He cannot flee from dread. Soren Kierkegaard wrote this in 1849 in The Sickness Unto Death. Dostoevsky was influenced by Kierkegaard, and whether he intended it or not, I see the underground man in these statements. Intelligence, such as IQ, is a familiar concept to us, and we recognize it to exist on a spectrum. What is not so commonly known is that consciousness is also on a spectrum. As with all extremes of human condition, we see what we would call a break in the perception of reality. As the underground man becomes hyper-aware of his surroundings and society at large, everything becomes futile. If he were to have the same amount of consciousness as normal people, the amalgamation of consciousness with animal instinct would have made him perceive reality in a much more bearable way. This is why we all feel dread to some extent, some more than others. This is why the sentence reads so true. Suffering is the sole origin of consciousness. Is it our suffering that creates consciousness? Or are we rather conscious and thus we suffer? Both are undoubtedly true. The other key point discussed in part 1 is where he critiques man's utopian notions. These aspirations would later develop into communism, or in Dostoevsky's case, the Soviet Union. His critique of man's nature towards utopianism is personally one of the most profound insights I have ever come across. The way he phrases it is so perfectly in line with man and our natural desire for dystopianism and chaos. He wrote, "Shower upon him every earthly blessing, drown him in a sea of happiness, so that nothing but bubbles of bliss can be seen on the surface. Give him economic prosperity, such that he should have nothing else but to sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of his species. And even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. He would even risk his cakes, and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal, fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly, that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that was so necessary, that men still are men and not the keys of a piano, which the laws of nature threaten to control so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar. And that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even if this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposefully do something perverse out of simple ingratitude, simply to gain his point. And if he does not find means, he will contrive destruction and chaos. will contrive suffering of all sorts, only to gain his point. He will launch a curse upon the world, and as only man can curse, maybe by his curse alone he will attain his object. That is, to convince himself that he is a man and not a piano key. Man would purposefully go mad in order to be rid of reason and gain his point. I believe in it, I answer for it. For the whole work of man really seems to consist in nothing but proving to himself every minute that he is a man and not a piano key. This is so innate in human nature that man is built for suffering, and a state of utopia only brings psychosis. If we think about it in an evolutionary sense, it rings true as well. Man has always faced challenges, and thus it has become ingrained into our being, hardwired and intertwined throughout our DNA. And as soon as we experience utopia or periods of comfort for too long, we start to feel uneasy, as if something is missing. Suffering. This was Dostoevsky's most important warning to the West, that man is sometimes extraordinarily, passionately in love with suffering, and that is a fact. Man is not built for utopia, and any attempt at it will end in ruins. And after seeing the likes of Stalin and all the tragedies of the Gulag, I would say it is a warning well warranted. The pursuit of rationality and the discarding of traditional values and beliefs in turn for nihilistic egoism is definitely something we as humans have been grappling with for some time now, if not even more so in the 21st century. And the first part of the book still stands as one of the most brilliant critiques of these ideologies. In the second part of the book, it provides glimpses into the underground man's past through a series of episodes. He recalls a visit to a brothel where he becomes infatuated with a young prostitute named Lisa, but ultimately rejects her. The underground man also recounts an ill-fated dinner party with former classmates, where his attempt to assert his individuality led to embarrassment and humiliation. Throughout these episodes, the underground man's feeling of alienation, bitterness, and existential despair are further explored, offering insight into his psyche and worldview. One of the key philosophical themes explored in the second part is the concept of free will and determinism. The narrator grapples with the idea that his actions may be predetermined by his circumstances and his psychology, yet he also desires to assert his autonomy and freedom. He rejects the idea that human behavior can be reduced to mechanical processes. He emphasizes the complexity and unpredictability of human nature, challenging deterministic explanations. Another important theme in the second part is the nature of suffering and redemption. The narrator's encounters with Lisa and his reflections on his own inner turmoil leads him to confront the possibility of redemption and the power of love and compassion. Through these interactions, Dostoevsky suggests that even in the depths of despair, there is the potential for transformation and spiritual growth. It is one of Dostoevsky's trademarks to add women in his literary pieces, such as Sonia Marmeladova in Crime and Punishment and Katerina Ivanova in The Brothers Karamazov. Many of the women depict a heroine role. Dostoevsky uses women to save the deeply troubled protagonist and relinquish their suffering. This is a very deep and profound idea that speaks again of the duality of man and the fact that chaos needs order just as much as order needs chaos. At the end of Notes from Underground, when the underground man rejects Lisa, it highlights his commitment to his own self-destructive and nihilistic tendencies. He chooses to remain in his isolated and cynical worldview, rejecting any possibility of genuine human connection or redemption. He chooses, as most of us do, to remain in suffering. Notes from Underground will remain one of the most significant and thought-provoking texts ever written. It speaks of the fundamental truths of human nature and the ambiguity of it. It contrasts it against rationality and utopianism, All these themes, reflecting man's rebellion against the world, will stand the test of time as long as man remains his cynical self. I say, let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea.